Good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from today. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health. The Open Mind is proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my honor to welcome and introduce today's featured speaker, Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, author of the critically acclaimed book, The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. And that book just actually came out in paperback this week. The Grieving Brain is based on Dr. O'Connor's own trailblazing neuroimaging work, her research in the field, and real-life stories. It brings together accessible science and practical knowledge to help us understand what happens when we grieve and how to navigate loss with more ease and grace. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor is an associate professor at the University of Arizona Department of Psychology, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab. She earned a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona in 2004, and following a faculty appointment at UCLA's Cousins Center for Psychoneuroimmunology, she returned to the University of Arizona in 2012. So I apologize for taking just a little longer with this introduction, but the Friends have some bragging rights when it comes to Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. In 2006, when she was a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA, Dr. O'Connor was awarded the very first Friends of Semel Research Scholar Award for her study on complicated grief as it relates to breast cancer. Dr. O'Connor's career trajectory, from early career researcher to now associate professor who directs her own lab, serves as a shining example of the impact that early seed funding can have on the success of a neuroscientist doing important groundbreaking research. Since Dr. O'Connor's award, Friends have gone on to give grants of $50,000, $25,000 per year for a 2-year study to 33 more early career neuroscientists, most who have also gone on to achieve great success in their careers. We're very, very proud of our scholar program and very proud of Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. So enough bragging, back to our program. Joining Dr. O'Connor in conversation is Dr. Brenda Bursch, psychologist and professor in the departments of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences and pediatrics at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, where she has been on faculty since 1994. The primary focus of Dr. Bursch's career has been with hospitalized medically ill children and their families. Thus, loss, death, and grief are topics that have been interwoven into her daily work. Dr. Bursch was one of Dr. O'Connor's supervisors in 2004 when Dr. O'Connor trained on her service during her internship year. We're very grateful to both our distinguished guests for taking the time from their busy schedules to share their knowledge and expertise about two subjects that are part of the human experience, grief and loss. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, please type it into the Q&A located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not the chat, the Q&A. We have a lot of people on this webinar today, over 2,800 people registered for this program. So we will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. Today's program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel that can be found on our beautiful new website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org, beginning tomorrow. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, a calendar of upcoming events, our recently established Teen Advisory Council, and the third annual Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held virtually on Sunday afternoon, April 30th. The deadline for submissions has been extended to March 22nd. So high school students, you have a little more time to get your short films about mental health into us. But get going. And there are prizes too. And lastly, our annual fundraising event, WOW 2023, that will be held on May 4th at the iconic Royce Hall, hosted by Lisa Kudrow with special guest Oprah Winfrey. Watch our website for more information on this exciting event that will raise funds to support mental health education, research, and patient care at UCLA. And now please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor and Dr. Brenda Bursch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki. It is so wonderful to be here, and for so many reasons. It's so great to see Brenda, and it's been so fun to talk with her in the days leading up to today, when we haven't gotten a chance to spend time together in a very long time. But I just really especially want to extend a thank you to the Friends of the Seminole Institute. This organization is remarkable, and I am very proud to have been the first winner of the Scholar Program Fellowship. It also meant that I had a chance to do research I might not have otherwise done, but more importantly, I had a chance to talk about that research with the public. And I had, moments where I was able to interact because Vicki would invite me to things. And it really got me thinking about science communication and how to talk about neuroscience in a way that was accessible to more people. So I'm very grateful to Vicki. I'm grateful to Andy Luchter, who was a big part of that as well as the many, many clinicians and researchers that I worked with at UCLA. So just by way of getting started, I think since I published the first neuroimaging study of grief back in 2003, a lot of people have asked me, why? Why have I spent so much of my career studying grief and grieving? And there are many reasons, some of them just that scientific curiosity. How is it that the brain understands what's happening when a loved one dies? More of the why and the how than just what do people experience. But there is, of course, a more personal reason as well. And I offer this because I think sometimes it helps to trust me that I have also known grief. So when I was in the 8th grade, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, which meant that we knew that it had traveled to other parts of her body already. And because I was only 13, what I didn't know was that she was only supposed to live the year. But I did know that grief came to our house, definitely. And my mother's oncologist described her as his first miracle. So she actually lived another 13 years, which was sort of a reprieve from the universe for my sister and I. But it meant that when she died, when I was 26, I was already in graduate school pursuing that degree in clinical psychology and beginning to learn neuroscience. And it meant that I just felt really comfortable with people who were grieving. If people cried uncontrollably in an interview, I was okay with that. And I tried to listen really closely to what people were telling me they experienced and how that then mapped onto the brain images that I was seeing when they were willing to lie in the neuroimaging scanner and participate in my studies. And I think if there's one thing really that I've taken away from this long period now of studying the neurobiology of grief, it's really that grieving could be thought of as a form of learning. And I say that because when a loved one dies, we have a lot to understand. That the brain is kind of mysterious in that you can actually listen to two streams of information at the same time. So on the one hand, we have a memory system in the brain, and you may have a memory of being at the bedside when a loved one died, or getting that awful phone call in the middle of the night, or being at a memorial or a funeral. So you know the reality of what has happened. But on the other hand, we all have what we call attachment neurobiology. And that is that once we bond with someone, because you don't really have grief unless you first have love, when we bond with someone, that gets encoded in our brain, in the very cells and proteins of our brain. And it comes with this deep, deep belief. I will always be there for you, and you will always be there for me. And the trouble is that when we're not with a loved one, we have a solution for that. Go get them, go find them, or make enough of a fuss that they come and find you. And so that's a very important and good solution. It keeps our relationships together. The trouble is that when a loved one dies, that solution doesn't work any longer, but it takes the brain a long time to update. You think of the person who wakes up every morning after thousands of days of waking up next to their spouse. And in that first moment of waking up, there's this disbelief sometimes. Where are they? So the fact that we have these two streams of information, on the one hand, you know the reality that they're gone. And on the other hand, you have this belief that they're somehow still there. And those cannot both be true, but it leads us to do things like pick up the phone to call them and tell them something that's happened. And then, of course, to remember that you can't do that anymore. So these are the types of lessons that I've learned from studying the neuroscience, the neurobiology of grief. And I think it gives us a new lens, a new way to think and talk about grief. And I think that's really important. So I'm really excited that Brenda and I will get a chance to talk about a bunch of different questions and answers. And it's really lovely to see you again, Brenda.
I am so happy to see you and honored that you asked me to join in this hour with you. I just can't tell you how much it's meant to me. Speaking of attachment, it's been so many years and yet I feel very attached. So that's very appropriate. And congratulations on this wonderful book. I'm just so proud of you. Not only is it really helpful to see how our brains can really be our friends while we're trying to go through these transformational moments of our lives. I shouldn't call them a moment, it's really a process. But also I am particularly appreciate that you understand that the best teaching comes when you share your personal experiences along with the science, right? You marry the two together, as you already kind of have mentioned. So I want to ask you some personal kind of questions, but also more like, things that might sound a little bit more academic, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
But on the, just kind of thinking personally, I think just one of the things that I'm curious about, and maybe I'm hoping that some others in the audience, I'm thinking, what would the audience want to know is, you've spent so much time. I know when I got interested in grief and death and dying, it's because I wanted to master it because it was so overwhelming and disturbing. I thought if I read enough and studied enough, then I would never be worried about it again. And I'm just kind of wondering, given that you've spent your whole career on this, how that has impacted your views on your current relationships or how you plan for future grief, or, if it's impacted you in any ways, if you think it's brought you gifts or not.
I think this is such an important question. I mean, in many ways, I think people don't want to know the information. They want to know, how would I use the information? And perhaps being able to convey that through personal experience is very helpful. So when my mother died, when I was 26, it was difficult. It was something different than I had expected, even though we had anticipated it for so long. And I also wanted to understand as much as I could, right? To solve things through learning somehow. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work exactly like that. Mm-hmm. I came to discover that knowing as much as I know about the neurobiology of grief, it helped me, but it didn't make me not feel grief. So
yeah,
I know. Too. Don't you wish that would work?
Yeah.
But, my dad died about 7 years ago, and it was a very different experience. Of course, it was a different experience because my relationship with my two parents is different and I was older. So I knew myself better. But a lot of it was that I recognized what was happening was completely normal, that falling into tears at 2 o'clock every afternoon was just how it was going to be for a while. And that I wasn't worried about whether I would ever get to a point where I didn't cry at 2 o'clock in the afternoon every day. And so knowing what I knew about grief meant that I was a lot more tolerant. I felt like I could bear it while it also felt unbearable. And I think it has changed my relationships now as well. I think by being willing to accept the fact that our loved ones will die and that we don't know when, it has meant that I have a certain preciousness that I feel when I'm with loved ones now. So both of my parents are deceased. And so at Christmas, we go to see my partner's parents. And there's this way in which spending the holidays with them is so lovely. And, let me tell you, they tell me the same story over and over again. They cook food that I think, I wouldn't have eaten that, whatever it is. It just doesn't matter to me in the same way because I know that this is my opportunity. This is the time that I have is right now. And so that I think has really been a change for me by being willing to think and accept the really painful emotional side of grief.
Right. I know one of the things that you have talked about in your book is, the big bag of judgments that we all have about how we should grieve or how others should grieve and whether you should be over it again or not, and the shame that we can sometimes feel and, how counterproductive some of the times that can be, right? And so I just kind of wanted to just stick to that topic for a minute, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I thought of a couple different situations that I think where it comes up a lot, and I wanted to know if you had thoughts about it. So one situation I'm thinking about is those times where we feel bad because we feel a sense of relief, or maybe where we're almost anticipating a death and hoping for it in a way, and then feel terrible about that because, it doesn't reflect your attachment. And I'm just kind of, if I think about it from, what your brain has to solve, like the neuroscience of it and learning to accept a new reality and all of that. I'm just kind of wondering how those fit together, or there's a comment that you wanted to make about that. And this was not pre-planned. She didn't know this exact question was coming up, just so everybody knows. But I'm curious, if you have thoughts about that, because I think a lot of us feel shame
Absolutely.
at times.
Yeah. I think it is true that grief usually feels really different than we're expecting it to feel. And that's in lots of different ways. So
right.
I agree that relief is often a feeling we have when we've been caring for someone around the clock. And when we want them not to be in the pain or the situation that they're in, I think it is a natural feeling to experience relief. But what's so amazing is the huge range of emotions that people experience when they're grieving. And that, I think, is, we forget that this is happening in our brain. It is a physiological event along with an emotional and cognitive event. And we know, even from animal neuroscience, that if you look at voles, the little rodents that are amazing because they pair bond for life. So once one vole has selected another vole, they prefer that to spend time with them forever. What's interesting about the neuroscience, if you separate them, you see changes in the brain. You see a decrease in the way that oxytocin binds, that hormone that we associate with nursing and attachment. And we see increases in what in humans is cortisol, that stress hormone. And that's happening even in voles who I don't think have a whole lot of language or a whole lot of understanding about death. But what it means is once you're bonded to someone, when you're separated from them, you are having a reaction. That is just part and parcel of it.
Mhm.
And so some of those things include intense anger sometimes,
Mhm.
anger with the person who died,
Mhm.
anger with the doctor who didn't save them, anger at yourself for having not, say, gotten them to the hospital sooner.
Mhm.
And what's important, I think, is that there are a lot of thoughts that then come along with these feelings. It can be guilt that comes along with the, what I like to call the would've, should've, could've,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So the would've, should've, could've are these thoughts. If only I, like I was saying, if only I got them to the hospital sooner, or if only the doctor would have run this other test, or if only they could have known not to take that last drink, or the millions of stories that we can create in our wonderful mind. But the trouble is, those stories are not usually very helpful. And
Mhm.
here's sort of why. If you think about that, the end of each of those stories is, and then my loved one would have lived.
Right.
But the painful reality is that they didn't live.
Mhm.
And so if we're spending a lot of time in these other stories that we're making up, then we're not actually really understanding what life is like now.
Mhm.
And life right now can have a lot of grief and suffering in it, but it also has a lot of opportunity. Life right now has the opportunity to spend time with your in-laws, to spend time with your grandkids or your puppy, or
Mhm.
the present moment, and really being a part of life now
Mhm.
is also an opportunity that our brain can offer us.
Kind of goes to your, if you're either ruminating too much or avoiding too much, that you're not really necessarily in the moment and moving through your grief as effectively perhaps, or as fully as you would otherwise. The other thing that I thought about was, when you think about the learning that has to happen, and the micro moments, if it's somebody that you live with versus, and how people, kind of getting back to the shame thing too, like it could feel bad that, oh my gosh, I was more upset when my cat died than when my grandmother died. But it helps to explain that. Do I have that right? Right. But
Yeah.
it's because that cat is, all ever present. And so you have a
Yes.
lot more of unlearning to do. And
So
is there anticipatory changes in your thoughts about your attachment, or the map you have of them when somebody's getting older, or when somebody is ill? Like, do you at a neuroscience level, is any of that a learning occur before a death sometimes?
it's such a good question. I just want to say something about the cat example first,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Yes. Yeah.
But remind me, because I may forget where I'm
Yeah.
at. So.
Between the two of us, we'll give it a try.
Okay, good. But the thing is, when we are attached to someone, when we have a bond to someone, it means that it's that feeling of, you'll always be there for me and I'll always be there for you. Well, I can't think of a better description of some of our pets, right? I mean, the care that we offer to a dog or to a cat, and the amount of special attention they give to us. I mean, that's the definition of an attachment relationship. And what's interesting is there is actually a neuroimaging study, a grief study, of people who had experienced the death of a pet. And it turns out that the parts of your brain that are used in that kind of grief are not different from any other attachment relationship.
Oh,
and so I think, it helps to remember that grief comes about because of this bond. And to the degree that they are more a part of your everyday life, or a part of how you understand the world, or a part of how you function in the world, that means that there are so many more things that are going to have to get updated, right? So,
and maybe a less complicated relationship too. So
yeah.
not as much conflict with your pet, maybe. So
that's
yeah,
right.
Yeah. It's
No,
interesting.
it's true. It's
Yeah.
true.
So
but you had an anticipatory grief.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that. That just was spontaneous. I just thought of that. Yeah. Is that something that happens? And it seemed, I mean, like I think about also, if like, I think about my mother has dementia. So that's something I'm having to watch that and live that and grieve that. And so I feel like she's not there in the way she was. So I can feel like my map of her, her is changing. And so I would imagine that would be something that you would also be able to identify at a neuroscience level. I don't know if it's been done yet, but I'm just kind of curious your thoughts about that.
So we try to distinguish two different aspects, I think, that you're noticing here. One is anticipatory grief. So we do know that when there is advanced warning, like someone has a terminal illness or a long time illness that we know they're not going to recover from, our brain is able to imagine what it will be like without them. And so that in and of itself, that anticipation is a way of updating our prediction, right? So when somebody dies of a heart attack, we had no way to predict, right, that this would suddenly one day, this person wouldn't be here. But when we know that they are ill, there is a way that our brain is sort of trying to update our prediction. Okay, this is going to happen. What's interesting is it can still feel really different once it does happen.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, people will often say to me, is there something I can do now to sort of get ahead of the curve, right? Can I grieve in advance or something?
Can I buffer this ahead of time so it's not so terrible? Yeah.
And
you have bad news on that front.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, unfortunately, it does often feel very different than we expect it to. For example, when my dad died, it hadn't really occurred to me that it would feel different to have no parents than to simply have lost my dad. And it was just something I couldn't have anticipated what that would feel like. So I think what's important is anticipatory grief does give us an opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to have some closure conversations. And this is what we're robbed of when it's an unexpected death. So we get a chance to say, thank you. We get a chance to offer forgiveness or ask for forgiveness when we know someone is ill. If we take that opportunity, we get a chance to say goodbye.
So that kind of takes away some of the should haves, would haves, could have.
It often does.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we do know in hospice research that those closure conversations can help to or they predict that people will have somewhat less severe grief. So that is a good thing. And I think as difficult as those conversations can be, it can be worth having them, especially if you know people who have been a hospice volunteer, or, you sort of think through in advance how you might go about that conversation. But the other piece that you were talking about, the other term that we sometimes use is ambiguous loss. Now, this actually refers to two different situations, but it's really because our personality and our body are two different things. And so an ambiguous loss means that, for example, even though your mom's body is still here, she still looks like her, and, and there are ways in which she acts like her, but her personality, the person to whom you are bonded, has changed and has changed probably sort of in an unidentifiable, right? Like it's not her. And so that ambiguous loss means that we're sort of mourning the bond, the person, while still caring for the person. And that's an incredibly difficult situation. The alternative version of ambiguous loss is when the person's body is gone because, for example, they might be missing in action, or the missing and murdered Indigenous people, for example, where they're gone, but we don't really know what's happened to them. And so you see the sort of flip side is that their body is gone. We're not with them. And yet we don't know if their personality is gone. And that equally is a very difficult kind of grief to go through.
Yeah. Makes sense. Another thing that you brought up in your book that I thought was really worth mentioning, because I think it can take people by surprise, is the concept that you can have unexpected new grief about the same loss at different times in your life. Like one that I hear frequently would be a woman who's lost their mother who then has this new grief when they themselves have a baby.
Yeah.
And so they identify with the mom role for the first time, and then
Yeah.
it just brings it all crashing down again.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if there's research on that, or I guess it's just a new way that your brain has to process what's happened.
Well, it's so interesting because our bonds mean different things to us at different ages, right?
Mhm.
And so I think I think there are lots of examples of this. It is the fact that we have a continuing bond, right? I still am able to call on my mom, right, and ask her for advice. I know what she would tell me.
Right.
Or, I will see things and I'll think, oh, my dad would have loved this, right? So we have an ongoing, what psychologists call a continuing bond with the person. And that looks a little different for everyone. A lot of people actually speak to their loved ones. We know from research in my lab, it's very common to have conversations. It doesn't mean you're crazy. And sometimes that happens, at a graveside. Sometimes that happens at an altar in your home, but sometimes it just happens. A woman told me about when she would drive home from work, it felt like her deceased husband was DJing the music that came on, right? Like he was selecting it specifically for her. And so what that means is, with this continuing bond, that relationship is going to change as you age, just like bonds change as you age. And on the one hand, it can bring up a lot of grief in the sense that another example is my sister recently got married. And, neither of my parents were there.
Yeah.
And it was really unexpected that this isn't how it's quite supposed to be,
Yeah.
But here's the flip side of that, I think. It also offers new opportunities for healing. And I say that because, when I was 26, and certainly when I was 13, when my mom was diagnosed, my whole developmental job was to separate from my mom, right? That's the phase of the life that I was in. I was supposed to go off to college. What it meant was there was a lot of conflict with my mom and I, just as there is for any
naturally,
teenager,
right?
Yeah,
normal.
Exactly. But what it meant was, suddenly when I got into my 40s, other people were making friends with their mom.
Right.
Other people were sort of coming to understand, either because they became a mom themselves or with sort of the wisdom of age. Oh, mom was really trying her best, it turned out. And what it meant was I was sort of able to forgive her for things that I didn't even really know that I was still holding on to, because I knew then that if she had lived, that we might have been able to have that. And so there's a way in which that continuing bond can be really useful. And I discovered that once I forgave her for some things that had happened in our life, I was suddenly able to remember a much more tender version of my mom than I had been able to remember before when I was really little, Yeah.
So I remember realizing, oh, wow, my mom was 22 when she had me.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Wow, that's
I'm glad
really young, right?
I couldn't have had that. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really changes how you see things, right?
So the continuing bonds is important, I think, to remember that it's okay that your relationship is still evolving with this person who's died.
I think that's a really, a point that we don't think about very much.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated you bringing that up in your book and talking about it now. The other thing that, we haven't talked about, and I just, again, thought about it in the last hour, is, with the earthquake in Turkey and the pandemic and like mass, when there's mass deaths and how hard it is to comprehend the enormity of something like that.
Yeah.
And, again, I don't know if there's research on this topic or what you might hypothesize about how, if there's different ways that our brain would react to something like that versus a loved one. I know you talked somewhat about celebrities and that how we could have an attachment to a celebrity we've never met because they've meant something or inspired us or been part of our life in a certain way. But do you have I don't know if you've thought about this or, do you have any?
I find that thinking about grieving as a form of learning has lots of benefits, that it makes you think of other things. So I sometimes think of it this way, our brain is really prepared, it is set up to help us transform our bond with the person who's died, that there is a natural path where we do update our understanding of what has happened, and we do strengthen attachments to living loved ones and so forth. Our brain is able to manage continuing bonds and living bonds with living loved ones. So if you think of that process as a learning process, then I sometimes think, all the things that make learning hard in other situations make learning hard during grief. So if there's a lot of other stresses going on, if you don't have enough resources, right, you lose a breadwinner in the family, or you lose a co-parent, if you are struggling with a health condition, if there's other stressors going on, just like learning anything is going to be harder, it's going to be harder to learn how to sort of create a meaningful life again. And so I think one of the challenges really with the pandemic, of the many challenges with the pandemic, was that we didn't have the same resources. We weren't able to just be with each other at a funeral and hug and hold each other. We weren't able to visit loved ones and have those goodbye conversations. And so all of those things make it much harder then to learn, well, what does it mean that this person is gone, and how do I live my life now? So I think sometimes that's a really helpful perspective.
And sometimes I suppose multiple deaths that you're having to deal with at one time as well. Well, a lot of what you're talking about are sprinkling little tidbits about, things that help us through and help us, reattach and move forward and find a place for that loved one where we can integrate them in and have them with us, but not be preoccupied and devastated all of the time. Are there other things that we can do to support our brain learning, our brain? I mean, I kind of walk away from this going, I love when you said that intrusive thoughts are like getting notifications on your phone to use your brain reminding you it's working on this. And I'm just kind of wondering if there's other things that you would say to people, like, this is how you can support your own grieving process, what you would, based on the neuroscience that you're familiar with.
I know that one way that we think about this is it's helpful to have a really big toolkit of different things you can use to cope with the fact that you are now a person who has grief. And I like to think of the idea that it isn't that any particular coping strategy is good or bad. Is it useful in this situation in the short term? And is it useful in the long term of sort of trying to create a meaningful life again? So here, I'll give you an example. So often people think avoidance is just the worst thing in the world and denial is terrible.
Right.
And I will tell you, for a long-term strategy, this is not a good strategy. We can talk about that in a sec. But in the short term, let's say, for example, you go to your daughter's soccer game and you think, you know what, for the next 45 minutes, I am going to pretend that her father has not died. I am just going to cheer for her and I'm going to focus on this and just pretend nothing else is happening. That's completely appropriate in that moment, right? That is a coping strategy that makes sense right then. And frankly, grieving is really stressful for your body.
And exhausting. It's exhausting.
Yeah. So giving yourself a break, there is nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, you can see
would you say even not only is it nothing wrong with that, but it's helpful.
It is even helpful.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. We need a full range of experiences. So the thing is that if every day, though, your strategy is, you know what, I'm just not going to think about this. I'm going to pretend this hasn't happened.
You're going to get more of those push notifications coming through if you do that, right?
That's right. In the long run, it's not going to help you to figure out how life works now, what makes sense for you now, and that sort of slow upward spiral of trying new things. So I think if you think about it as, it isn't really time that heals. It's having experiences over time that heals. And so if you think of it that way, it's because your brain needs experiences in order to heal, right?
It needs those experiences to replace the neural wiring that was there before.
To update. Yeah. So if you are an older couple, say, or any couple, frankly, and you used to go out to dinner with your other couple friends, and your spouse has died, and you think, you know what, I just can't do this. I'm not going to go out to dinner with them. It may be worth, eliciting some support from your friend group and saying, you know what, I want to try this. I don't think I'm going to enjoy it very much, but I think it might be a good experience. We'll see. And the first time you go out to dinner, you're going to have a lot of grief. Of course, your spouse is going to be on your mind all the time, right? And you may not even stay for all of dinner. But, the second time you do it, you are going to have some grief. And you're also probably going to get into a conversation and realize there's a book that you hadn't heard of, and maybe you'll check that out. And it's this very slow reemergence of sort of, oh, there are good parts to life when I'm able to focus on them. And eventually those lead us back into having meaningful relationships.
Would you say that process is the same if you're also traumatized by the death? So, how does trauma complicate this process?
This is very complex. So in general language, in general conversation, people often use grief and trauma interchangeably. And I don't actually think that they are interchangeable. I mean, in a very clinical sense, trauma is sort of a version of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And so the hallmark of trauma is you had an experience where you felt utterly helpless. And now that's being generalized to all the situations in your life. So you were helpless because you were in combat, or you were helpless because you were raped. And now you're living a life where you feel fragile. Everything feels like you have no control. Grief is a little bit different. Grief is, this person has died, or I am missing this thing in my life, whatever that might be. And it is not coming back. And can I go on without it? So the sort of core of trauma is usually anxiety, even fear. And the core of grief isn't even sadness, it's yearning. It's yearning for that person or place or way that things were. And so they are actually a little bit, it's subtle, but they're a little bit different. Unfortunately, people can have both at the same time.
Right. And so so your brain is trying to work on both of those.
Yeah.
So I imagine it would prolong things. And is there, research to suggest that, you work on one or the other first, or that or is it just?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And actually, there are some researchers in the Netherlands, Manik Jalantic at the University of Utrecht, who works with refugees. So a lot of refugees from the Middle East come to the Netherlands, and she works at a center where she's coping with people who have both trauma and grief. They have had loved ones die, but often in very traumatic situations. And she's actually done some research on what do you treat first. And her so far, the state of the evidence is that you actually work on the grief first. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One of them is grief is often an easier one to create rapport with the therapist. And so by having that stronger relationship, by having worked through some of that, it can make it easier then to have that supportive relationship to work through some trauma, which can often be very difficult to work through.
I always think of grief and grieving as natural or normal. And sometimes trauma does not feel that way. It's like, this is, it's more of an alarm system going off. So that makes sense to me from that perspective as well.
And yet both extremely painful. And again, it's physiological. So when that bond is broken, we know that you don't make as many opioids, for example, naturally. And so that pain we describe is very real. And I see that Vicky is.
And then you have also like this arousal in your central nervous system from trauma that it just makes it so hard to calm. And anyway, so hi, Vicky. Welcome back.
Hi, Brenda and Mary Frances. Thank you so much for this very enlightening conversation and sharing your insights and your knowledge with all of us. What a privilege it is to hear the two of you in conversation. Believe it or not, we have over 50 questions. So you've touched on some of the things that people were asking about. Anticipatory grief was one, but there's also several questions here about studying the grieving brain from traumatic loss. And these several people here, it's suicide of a child.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment, because
this is, of course, such a devastating loss on so many different levels, right? So while you have grief, there is, in an attachment relationship with a child, there is this desire to have protected them. And so the sort of beliefs we have about ourselves and about that person are very much in that attachment modality. And so I think, we don't necessarily have studies that address the neurobiology of suicide loss, but we do know some of the psychology of loss by suicide. And that anger and guilt, in many ways, I think you can think about the fact that if your loved one just disappears, it's natural to feel angry with them. It's also natural to feel like, did I do something wrong? And so that's true even in any kind of grief, in any kind of loss. So I think that gets very much compounded then when we believe we should protect someone, or we feel that if it's not a child, for example, if it's a partner who died by suicide, we feel sometimes angry with them. So there are many layers to work through, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible. It doesn't mean that there aren't ways to work with, for example, a therapist, to learn new strategies. A man that I know who often speaks in my class, his son died by suicide, and he actually gave me the term, the would've, could've, should've thoughts. And he said, eventually I had to accept the fact that there were no answers to those thoughts. There was no way through the question, that I had to figure out how to go around the questions. And so those are some of the skills that sometimes a therapist can really help us to figure out how to engage.
Mary Frances, when I was reading your book, one of my very best friends who performed my wedding ceremony died by suicide as well. And I was thinking about, when I was reading, it was like, where is your loved one? And, where they are in time and space, and then how close you feel to them. And kind of feeding the could've, would've, should've that can prolong grief could be related to that closeness. Like, was I not close enough? Like, did they not love me enough? Or was I not good enough?
Yes.
If I was better, then they would have wanted to stay, or they would have, and so it just seems like there's so many extra would've, could've, should'ves that naturally come in those situations. That it just by its very nature will make it harder for our brains to adapt.
Absolutely. And I think, your brain is really trying to reconnect you with this person, even though that's not possible, which sounds crazy, but that's
screaming no the whole time, essentially.
Right? Exactly. This should not be.
Yeah.
And so I think even coming to understand how our thoughts work is something that you can do with a therapist, right? It's sort of it sounds a little strange, but by understanding, when are you likely to have these thoughts? What can you do with them in the moment? Is there a way to get yourself out of the rumination sort of stuck? Can you go outside? Can you breathe deeply? Right? So you're not even
you laugh at the funny story about that person, or see fun time photos with them. And
That's right. So that it's not that you're solving the question of what happened and why, but you're solving the question of what can I do right now?
And what's my new relationship with them?
Yeah.
Thank you both. There are several questions here or comments about being stuck in grief, complicated grief for years.
Yeah.
And I know, Mary Frances, you studied complicated grief. It was part of our first Scholar Award. And I wonder if you could comment about that.
Yeah.
And Brenda as well.
Yes. So I think it is useful for people to know that, clinicians and researchers recognize that people have, you almost might call them different flavors of grief. And so most of us, we know from research over time, the waves of grief become less intense and less frequent, and we get better at coping with them when they come. But there is a group of people, a very small group of people, maybe 1 in 10 bereaved people, who you just don't see change over time. So that this person it's almost as though it just happened, even when it has been years. And my desire has a lot been to try and figure out the neurobiology of that. Is there something unique about what's happening for these people having this flavor of grief? Now, I think there are a few good things to know. We don't have the answer yet, for sure. We know that there are parts of the brain that are reacting differently when you have prolonged grief or complicated grief. We can sort of use those interchangeably. We know that there are parts of the brain that are reacting differently. And it is possible that there's different receptors in that part of the brain for this group of people, or that there's something about the history of how that part of the brain developed differently. Those are not answers that we have yet. The answer that we do have is that there is targeted psychotherapy specifically for prolonged grief that we know from numerous NIH-funded randomized control trials. This targeted therapy works for many, many people, even when it has been a decade since the person died. And what you see is that the grief experience, it's not that it goes away, it's that by working with a therapist, you can develop skills that sort of get you back on that more natural healing trajectory. So we're not going to be able to take people's grief away, but we are often able to sort of return them to a more natural grieving trajectory where there is less intense and less frequent waves of grief, and the ability to create a meaningful life increases. So I will just offer that if people are specifically interested in this, and therapists who are trained in this, if you Google prolonged grief and Columbia University, there is a center there that has just done groundbreaking work, has done many of these randomized clinical trials, and they keep a list of therapists who are trained in prolonged grief therapy. So it's certainly one way to think about it. And I'm just so relieved to know that it's hard work, but that there is a psychotherapy that's very specific for grief.
Thank you. Brenda, did you want to add anything to that?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
That was brilliant. I was going to ask her how one would find such a therapist, and I didn't have
answered
to.
it.
Mm-hmm.
We have a comment here, question. Why does the brain stay in the negative? The last images of my mom being ill and dying in front of me are so strong in my mind, and reaching back to good memories is increasingly difficult. And it's been 2 years.
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult thing. And we know that that last part of someone's life is not the totality of our relationship with them, right? And so some of this is just knowing that your brain does have all of the memories. And sometimes it is a matter of learning how your mind works and learning how to shift your attention. So being able to accept the fact that you are going to have those awful images that will come to you, and also that you can develop skills to sort of shift your attention also away from them. There is nothing about them that you are required to spend time with. It doesn't help your loved one that you spend time with those images. It doesn't really help your living loved ones or your own life. And so they are difficult skills to learn, but learning more about how your mind works, when do these images come to you? Is there a way to shift your environment, to go outside for a walk? Is there a way to have a photo on hand that reminds you of a different part of your life? I think it often comes down to people feel this need to stay with some of those negative aspects. And many people describe it feels like their last connection to this person. And so it's hard to give up the pain if the pain feels like your last connection to this person. But I think it's important to remember your brain is carrying all of your connections to that person, and they're not going to go away. You are not going to forget this person. So trusting your brain a little bit may help. I don't know, Brenda.
I have a question, because I've had this experience with a friend personally who had this happen to them. And one of the things that was really effective for him, and I'm curious to know if any research has been done on this, is basically image replacement, where he spent hours upon hours purposefully looking at other happier pictures to replace that last horrible picture he had, because it was pretty traumatizing for him. Absolutely. And so he kind of, for, days and hours just went through lots and lots of books and, of photos that they had, and focused on them purposefully to get new images in his mind to try to override that last image. So really trying to capitalize on the wiring of the brain to be focused on other things. So, again, kind of getting back to what you're saying, can you call that avoidance? Maybe that is helpful avoidance, or maybe it's like focused attention, right? We know focused attention does impact your brain and does make a difference. And so is there, I know like for nightmares, image rehearsal therapy has been shown to be effective. Has there been anything like this for grief? I've not seen anything.
I think this is, your brain can develop, I think of it as almost grooves, right?
Right.
So if you're bringing the same thing to mind again and again, it becomes more accessible. Right. Not in a blameful way. Simply that's, the more things
it's learning, your brain learns whether you want it to or not.
You're going to think about the things you've been thinking about. Right. And so it takes something very intentional then to override some of those grooves. So I think image replacement is a great example. I think that I know for myself, just getting into a new environment became really important. I just needed to change the inputs that I was getting. I think that people sort of deal with that in different ways, but I think, yes, the thinking about other images, it means that there are new grooves, there are other grooves that we can adopt.
That'll compete with the terrible
that will compete. Exactly. And this is another really interesting one. So this is adapted from anxiety disorders, something we might call worry time. In anxiety disorders, we might call grief time. And that is, if it's 2:00 and you're supposed to be headed to a meeting and you start having thoughts and images, you say, you know what? It's important to have grief. I will have that at 4:00 grief time. And I'm just going to put it aside for now. And then at 4:00, I'm going to put on, sad music or whatever it is. And I'm going to have my grieving. It helps you to learn to go into the wave of grief and also come out of it. The waves are natural, but that's usually the way they work.
And it doesn't always work in the beginning.
No, it doesn't.
So you have to forgive yourself in the beginning. You get better at it with practice, right?
It's a skill.
Yes.
Thank you both. Very good advice. Thank you. We have a question here. How do you get away from the never-ending cycle of the what ifs?
So
And what are
again,
some strategies?
yeah, exactly. I mean, if someone is really struggling with this is sort of something that cognitive behavioral therapy is very much designed to help us with. So it often is helpful to work with someone else in order to learn some new skills, to have some new views on what's happening in your mind and how you might cope with it.
To kind of challenge you sometimes, right?
Yep.
Because if you're just in your brain, you just loop.
Yep.
And so, and our loved ones can be super helpful and our friends, but sometimes, especially if they're grieving with us,
Yes.
they can feed it. So it can feel good, but then sometimes it's helpful to have an outside person who can also say, let's look at the facts.
Yeah.
Let's follow this train of thought down the rabbit hole and see where we end up. Is that helpful? And to kind of come at it from a different perspective.
I think that's a great word, helpful. I think one of the things that sometimes happens is not, is this thought true?
Right.
Like, I should have done X, Y, and Z, but is this thought helpful?
Yes.
Is it helpful for me to be spending time thinking this thought? And is it helpful for my life now? And so sometimes it can be true or it cannot be true, or we don't know, but we can recognize it's not helping me to be stuck in this way.
Thank you. We have time for just a couple more, and we have so many good questions here, but this question, and comment, my pain is very deep. It tells me how much I loved my wife. Over time, as the pain subsides, I'm afraid that my love will also subside. But I never want to lose that love and my feelings for her. Can you explain? It's very, very touching.
It is very touching.
That's I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah.
One.
You know, I think about it this way, and I will just say, I don't think that advice is really how grief works. I think I can lend you my glasses and say, this is a way to maybe look at what you're seeing, and maybe something new will come into focus, but it doesn't mean that I have all the answers. Nonetheless, this is sort of how I think about that. When you bond with someone, we know it changes the way the proteins are folded in your brain. We know that it changes the way that synapses are formed between neurons. That only happens because of that loved one, because you loved them and they loved you. They are still physically in your brain, even when they are not physically in the world. And I find this extremely comforting. I am still carrying my mother and my father, and it means that I can call on them because they are physically in my brain. That isn't going to go away. And the feeling of love that I have, the knowing of love that I had from them, I can call on that. And it now means that I can offer that to other people, that love that I experienced, I can give to a student or to, a friend's baby who was just born. That comes from me because it is in my brain. They are with us forever.
That's lovely, lovely way to explain it and hold it in your heart. I want to thank you both. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you for this really enlightening conversation. I think you've taught us so much, given us so much to take home and unpack and try to incorporate into our lives, which we're all going to experience grief at some time.
Yeah.
Thank
you, Vicki, and thank you, Brenda. It was good to be able to go there in this topic together.
Well,
it's my pleasure.
Thank you both. Thank you to everybody that tuned in today, for the privilege of your time, Brenda, Mary Frances. We hope that you'll all come back for more Open Mind programs. Our next one is on Wednesday, March the 1st. And this is what it sounds like, what the music you love says about you. It's a little bit lighter topic, but also very important. So thank you again from all of us at the Friends of Assemble and the Resnick Board. We wish you all a good night and peaceful night, and thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.